Okay, good afternoon everybody. I hope you had a good lunch. I'm going to present this afternoon mainly some of the generic lessons that we learned from the Omega 2 project. And I'm only going to talk about a selection of some of the lessons. It was a tough choice which ones to talk about. But anyway, for better or for worse, I made a decision. Those are the things I'm going to talk about, and I'll round off with some of the sort of key overarching conclusions that we've come up with. As Harry mentioned this morning, the sort of family, if you like, of key lessons or insights about mega projects, final phase and delivery that we've come up with. And in conversation this morning, actually, with Henrik, it reminded me that a lot of these are about actually the need for a kind of a change of mindset on the part of those who plan, appraise and deliver projects. And indeed, a greater awareness of the risks, the uncertainties and complexities that these types of projects generate. And the one I'm going to talk about this afternoon, albeit briefly, and I would emphasise there's quite a lot of complexity involved, but I'll try and sort of boil it down to its simplest form in a sense, just for the sake of discussion in a sense. So I'm not covering the things down here. Harry touched on the notion of success and failure, and it is clearly a very complex issue. And at the end of the day, we have to ask some pretty basic questions about success and failure. For whom are these projects a success or a failure? Who are the winners and losers? And indeed, defining winners and losers is a pretty immature methodology, I would say. And that's a lot to do with defining what the project boundaries are. Again, that's immensely difficult over space and time. And when do you judge success and failure? On completion of the project, and what we often do, particularly in terms of iron triangle type considerations. But over what period? 10 years time, 50 years time, and these projects last an awful long time. And indeed, I deliberately put a picture of the Millau Viaduct into the slide. Quite often responses to these projects are pretty emotional, and bridges seem to be particularly well received because they're often very beautifully simple. So that's one of the considerations that we need to bear in mind. As Harry mentioned this morning also, it's beholden upon me really to say there are some health warnings that accompany these findings. We interviewed a lot of stakeholders, well over 300. The emphasis though was on those that were deeply involved in the project, the decision makers. It wasn't ever supposed to be a stratified sample of people impacted or affected by the project. The Omega project itself generated over 50 lessons, some major, some minor. But the important thing here is that almost all of them are interrelated in some way. So what I say this afternoon should never be taken out of it. It really needs to be read in the context of the whole suite of lessons. So really all I can do today is just present an overview which hopefully once you've had a look at the executive summary will start to mean a little bit. Harry also mentioned this morning the power of context. It's pretty evident from our findings that context is fundamentally important on all aspects of the mega project planning and delivery. And by that, temporal, environmental, social, physical, institutional, and political. And as we touched on this morning, things like mega events, such as the Olympics, and major political change. And so, I think this is part of the theme for this afternoon, the transferability of those Omega lessons to different contexts. Is not necessarily a straightforward matter. again, as Harry mentioned, our case studies are pretty well they are all located in the developed world. And again, part of the theme for this afternoon, are these lessons necessarily transferable? And even if they are, and we believe a lot of them are, how do we ensure that sufficient attention is paid to context and trying to apply those? So one of the first, something's happened to the bulletin there, but never mind. One of the first sort of themes that we picked up was the way that mega projects become agents of change, particularly change at context, and that they have very significant multiple spatial, economic, environmental, and other implications. And as a result, there is a pretty clear need for a change of mind concerning the way they're planned, positioned, and framed. And fundamentally, many of them become more than something about the delivery of transport system, either explicitly or very often implicitly. As Harry mentioned this morning, quite often these multiple combinations of mega projects alone, do change over time, particularly given their long lead time. And they respond to things like boom and bust situations in the economic climate, changes in political leadership. But what we found in looking at the various processes is that actually the ability or the potential of mega projects to change the context into which they're placed is often quite underappreciated. Now, this is not something that we've necessarily come up with. This is something that came across quite strongly from the stakeholders that we talked to. So as a result, there's quite a lot of indication that many positive and negative consequences arise, and indeed that quite often there are lost opportunities because this relationship between mega projects and context is underexplored. As I say, many mega projects are rather narrowly framed as providers of transport infrastructure, and from our case studies, I've sort of peppered this presentation with a few examples, but you have to trust me that there are more examples. Western Harbour Crossing in Hong Kong and the Athens Metro, we would see as both having represented somewhat missed opportunities to explore the possibility that these projects could have done something for major structural territorial change, or indeed regeneration. The one I'm familiar with, because it's where I've lived for quite a long time, is Western Harbour Crossing in Hong Kong. And it was pointed out to us that, following the introduction of the tunnel, there's quite a big change in land values, which could have been exploited as a potential for regeneration. But some of the other projects, were inherently positioned as part of major territorial and/or sectoral change strategies. Tokyo's Metropolitan Expressway and its Oedo line, and the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, or HS1 in England, were ultimately seen as components of broader change strategies. But the important thing, the rider there is, obviously with varying degrees of success, and quite often such changes were bolted on at a rather later stage. In other words, when the planning process had made a fair degree of progress. With that in mind, and I would argue that actually a lot of these questions are probably implicitly asked by the people who plan and deliver projects, but it's not done in any sort of explicit way, in a sense. Is the project that you're planning expected to function as an agent of change, and if so, in what way? And what sort of change are you expecting? What forces of change are you trying to influence? And over what time frame These are all very important questions. Do you have the resources, be they financial, institutional, personnel-based or legal, to actually affect those changes, or to make the most of those changes, and over what period? And what are the potential project boundaries? I think it's fair to say, we struggled with this for quite a long time. And I want to cop out in any sense, but we came to the conclusion that actually, we have to have a lot of sympathy with the guys that appraise these projects in particular, because defining the project boundaries, even discerning the project boundaries over time and space, is hugely difficult, let alone trying to put a value on them or any other sort of dimension. Harry mentioned open systems, and here, I think we see in its simplest terms open systems as being relevant to mega project planning in the sense that they interact very dramatically with the areas and the sectors and the communities they serve, traverse and impact. Conversely, many projects are treated as somewhat closed systems, where there's a kind of general belief that you can put these projects out through the tenders and all the rest of it, so they can be sort of pretty well controlled and aren't seen to be necessarily affected by the outside world. So as we've seen, mega projects are themselves often changed as a result of changing contextual influences. But they do also alter the context into which they're placed, and there's a reference back, if you like, to the agent of change idea. But those changes are continuous, and they are evolving. They don't stay static at any point. So you're constantly faced with a dynamic situation which never actually reaches equilibrium. So actually trying to model that situation over time is hugely difficult and requires a degree of sort of out-of-the-box thinking, I think, to a considerable extent. But we, based on our findings, based on the case study that we conducted, we suggest in particular that an open system approach, whereby you are open to contextual change, is pretty well fundamentally important to all aspects of planning and appraisal for those projects that are expected to have particularly complex interrelationships with the areas that they serve. And clearly, fundamentally important also that those external influences need to be thought about, identified in plans and strategies. And we do acknowledge that is hugely important, because not only at the planning and appraisal stage, but also it does impact on project management approaches. And we found, and again, this is what stakeholders are telling us, when I say stakeholders, interviewees, that actually we're pretty good at project managing issues and contextual changes that arise over time within the project. But we're not so good at being able to discern the sorts of changes that can fundamentally influence project delivery. We talked yesterday about, for example, the foot and mouth outbreak in the UK for one of our case study projects, the M6. Nobody could have foreseen that, but it took them off-site right in the middle of their implementation program for about 6 months. So a major sort of cost and timing. Something like 50% of the case studies we looked at were considered as closed systems, not only during the implementation stage, but also at the planning stage. But what interviewees are telling us is quite right, is that those mega projects that are treated as closed systems during the early stages of project development, when all the ideas are starting to coalesce and conflict in some instances, they can't be properly appraised as part of the much wider context in which they exist. So projects that are considered as closed systems face the possibility that their contextual impacts will be pretty seriously underestimated, whether those be beneficial or somewhat disadvantageous. And again, I hark back there to the notion that MTPs are very significant agents of change. A number of the case studies we looked at, and here I quote the Tokyo Metropolitan Expressway, but also the Milan Bridge, as we said, changed from being a closed system to a rather more open one. In the case of the Tokyo Metropolitan Expressway, that was to do with local pressure in seeking a more environmentally acceptable solution to the project. In the case of the Milan Bridge, it was as much of an EU regulation as anything else. Harry introduced this notion this morning that MTPs are somewhat organic in their nature. They do change over time. And something that I think we hadn't perhaps anticipated, but was put to us by a series of interviewees, that actually these projects quite often need a considered period of reflection, or a time to breathe, as it was put to us. And that those times to breathe can present very special opportunities that can be exploited by key decision makers. So whilst these are organic evolutionary processes, they often, we found in our case studies, that they actually lead to a pretty substantial change ultimately in the basic raison d'etre of the project, or indeed its scope and scale. So they are moulded over time, and they do tend to bounce off various different contextual influences, be they political, economic, or whatever. So they do become fundamentally changed. So in that sense, it's wrong to consider them as highly controllable engineering artifacts, particularly for planning and appraisal. So the argument here is that those types of times to breathe, are important in enabling projects to respond to changing ideas and visions of future possibilities. But of course, that's very difficult in contexts where the project is impacted by an overall emphasis on speed and delivery. And that seems to be something, at least in the UK, that we are chasing with ever increasing firmness. So I think the argument here is that these times for reflection, or these times when projects are stalled for one reason or another, shouldn't necessarily be seen as ineffective. But they might be used as a period where you can, or should be used as a period where you can explore a much wider range of visions and possibilities. And conversely, we argue for the very major complex projects, an overemphasis on speed can be harmful. Notwithstanding the fact that speed of delivery is often seen as the most important factor, along with finance. But of course, quite rightly, you can't let these periods of reflection go on forever. So there has to be a degree of control. But at the end of the day, the institutional framework that exists surrounding the project is again highly important. So there has to be an ability and a willingness of those agents responsible for planning and delivery to explore these changing visions, stakeholder agendas, and wider contextual. Some contrasting, I'm drawing here, forgive me for this, from the UK experience. I mean, arguably, the JLE might be argued missed a bit of a trick in the sense that there was an 18-month hiatus somewhere. And it was said to us that there were all sorts of possibilities, this opened up all sorts of possibilities which could have been exploited in terms of regeneration of around the station, and indeed in terms of the overall design of the station. By contrast, the long and difficult story of the Channel Tunnel Railway, which goes back, if you like, ultimately centuries, but in our terms from at least the 1970s. The hiatus over the choice of route, which took a long period of time, actually enabled, with the influence of a very strong political champion in the form of Michael Heatherton, to actually explore some new ideas and new visions, to the extent that the red line there, being the Channel Tunnel Railway, was seen as a pretty, well, a very important sign for the redevelopment and restructuring of the whole landscape. We've already mentioned, that framing of these projects is fundamentally important, and the changing demands on them makes it very, very difficult to judge success and failure. And unless you have a pretty fair, if you like, or pretty well articulated, should I say, means of framing the project, the appraisal process often becomes difficult, occasionally misleading, but often non-transparent. And again, it's perhaps surprising, given the nature of many of the people we talk to, that the traditional iron triangle criteria of project management was seen as being of only a partial criteria for determining project success. Now, we acknowledge it's very fundamentally important. But actually, at the end of the day, the key decision makers that we talked to and who talked about other key decision makers do, fundamentally recognise that actually, you have your CBA results and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, most of these things are political decisions. I mentioned earlier, there's also the aspect that because these projects involve a very wide spectrum of interested stakeholders or impacted stakeholders, they all have often quite fundamentally different expectations of the projects. And quite often the perceptions of the success and failure of projects might well be based on only one part of the project, a bit outside their house, for example, or even an emotional response to it. Indeed, I mentioned the Milan Bridge. Bridges seem to be scored particularly well on an emotional basis. But also that those changes, those emotional responses and those perceptions of success and failure do change over time, such that today's successes are sometimes seen as tomorrow's failures and vice versa. And quite often, what was put to us by stakeholders was the notion that who could imagine now, given the previous difficult circumstances in the project, a city without this particular piece of infrastructure? It arose in the case, I remember quite well, of Melbourne City Link, for example. So what we're saying is, if you want to have a fair and transparent basis on which to judge project success and failure, you need to have a well-articulated statement of their goals and objectives, and all the assumptions and appraisal criteria that you can put into the kind of overall package, and that you need to discuss those pretty very well with all key stakeholders. Interestingly, I put this slide in because it does contradict somewhat some other sort of seminal work in this area, and we all know what that is. I would have to say, and again, quite often the devil's in the detail, how you present this data. Our information presented here is based on the time of project approval. Okay? So the average cost overrun for all of our 30 projects was found to be about 22%. That's outturn cost versus cost at the time of project approval, formal project. Okay? If you take it back much earlier, then you'd have a totally different picture. But we felt that this was the most rational way to these types of notions of success and failure. Only one of our projects was exceeded its original budget by 100%. We talked about briefly earlier. 3 were between 50 and 100% over budget, but some came in, you know, very close to the budget, about half of them. About a half were delivered either on time or less than a year behind the original schedule. So all this is kind of suggesting that, depending on how you look at it, actually the sort of project management style, the project management consideration, is actually not doing too bad. But you know, only a third of them got more than 75% of their initial objective. In other words, when the project was initially launched. That said, where those projects had bolted on objectives attached to them, the success rate was much, much higher. Again, reflecting this evolution, if you like, in the way the projects come back. So projects like CTRL, JLE, Melbourne City Link and the Big D actually suggest that perceptions of success and failure do change pretty fundamentally over time. And in all 4 of those cases, you know, there were problems in the planning, funding and delivery period that attracted a lot of controversy, especially true of the big digger. But subsequent perceived benefits have dramatically changed that view. So as I say, you know, it's pretty clear that today's failures can become tomorrow's successes and vice versa. How am I doing? Another 20 minutes. Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh my goodness me, I'm going to have to run. Okay. Which is a shame, because I think a lot of this is what we're talking about this afternoon. Context sensitivity is fundamentally important on the part of planning and delivery agents. Especially if they are to successfully identify the key risks, uncertainties and complexities that are likely to impact on the project. Particularly important is the need to identify those critical contexts and the interdependencies between them that surround those project decisions that are absolutely pivotal in pushing the project forward. We also came across this notion that context sensitivity on the part of planning and delivery agents, those that are very good at it and quite well placed to identify those moments in time when it is ripe for taking a critical decision, often referred to us as when the planets align. Some call it serendipity, and making the most of serendipity. Now, we became aware that politicians and investors are particularly good at this, and especially project champions, very good at sensing those periods in time when the time is right to take a decision. It was also said to us, you know, by a leading civil servant, again, being contextually aware that there's nothing worse than launching the best project at the worst possible time. And that's certainly impacted on a number of the Hong Kong projects, for example, which were launched in the middle of the Asian financial crisis. But many experienced, and I'll say the emphasis there is on experienced project planners and deliverers, you know, are pretty aware of context. But fundamentally, there's, you know, not many examples out there where there's an attempt to systematically identify and track contextual change, irrespective of the fact that it has a fundamental impact on the project. Clearly, there's a need to be, you know, if you're launching one of these projects, to have a good sense of the, if you like, institutional, political context into which they're placed, so that, you know, it's clearly a major need to, you know, differentiate between those projects where there's a lot of control and those over impacts from those where there's not so much. Greece being an example of the latter, where all 3 of the projects tended to, great projects though they may have been, were impacted by all sorts of uncontrolled development that arose as a result of them. As Harry mentioned again this morning, contexts are being changed, you might say at an ever-increasing pace. And it's interesting here, that this resonates pretty strongly with some of the transnational projects. The Warson Link being one, which sorts of link economies in Denmark. But also, in its own way, the City Island and Jubilee Line were all about promoting or maintaining London's preeminence as a major financial centre. Almost tempted to say that the kind of preeminent example, in this sense, was Hong Kong, where and I was involved at the time, a whole basket of projects were put forward in support of the territory as it was then, to maintain its position as a major Asian hub. And I have to say also to build confidence in the local population prior to the handover in 1997. So, some conclusions. It seems to be clear to us, and I apologise, I've kind of rushed a very complex issue with involving a whole bunch of lessons, and I'll call it out in 1 or 2. But it does seem clear that in judging project success, we need to have a much wider set of really quite complex considerations. And that, somehow we need to get across to those planning and delivering these projects, or conceiving that it can't be just about the iron triangle without the importance of space. So, MTPs are clearly open systems, many of them have very fundamental agent of change functions, they evolve over time, and all of this adds to their complexity. So it's arguably, it's pretty unrealistic, especially for big projects with very lengthy lead times, to expect that you can control every aspect of them over time. And yet, that in many contexts, that's precisely what we do. And indeed, in many professions, that's precisely what is expected. So, because of that, and it's kind of easy for us to say, you do need to have pretty holistic, flexible, and robust strategy that incorporate periods of engagement with project stakeholders. Now, that's difficult, unquestionably, when there are so many political imperatives that surround each project. It's also imperative, as we've said earlier, to have a clear sense of the frame in which the project is set, so that they can be judged on a reasonable and rational basis. And to go back to one of my earlier slides, to ask questions such as, who are the winners and losers? When do we look at the relative success or failure of the project now, in the future? Because those start to give us clues to issues such as how you can retrofit projects to contextual situations. Thank you. I'd say I'll sort of give a bit of a quick
Wetzel, former chair of the Greater London Council's Transport Committee and the first vice chair of Transport for London for 8 years under Ken Livingstone's chairmanship. I was very interested in what you have to say. In terms of winners and losers, have you come across any project which has been gauged or assessed to be a successful project in which land values have not increased? And following on from that, I would suggest that land is not a commodity like cars, trains, buses. It's not man-made. Land is a free gift of nature, really intended for all of us to benefit from, not just individual landowners who happen to be lucky because they own a piece of land where you're building a major project, or they heard about the project first. And I go to China every year, And I've witnessed this on many occasions, different cities in China, where people on the inside know where the new blue lines are on the city's map for the underground and or the subway, and they purchase land or buildings, property, in order to benefit from the uplift that will take place over the subsequent 10 years. And what I suggest to you is two things. One, that we use this uplifting land values as a way of paying for the project itself, and we could do that through an annual land value tax. And two, more importantly, that we assess a project on the drawing board against its effect it will have on land values. And if, for example, we're going to build a railway in the middle of the Sahara Desert between two places that have no minerals, no population, no oasis, then the effect on land values would be zilch, and it would be a nonsense to build such a railway. But if we were building it somewhere where land values are going to increase dramatically, that is some justification, because the increase in land values is a measure the importance the rest of society puts on that new major project.
If I can take your first question, I would say that I don't recall, and my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, of any project that didn't in some way enhance land value. But that's it, the qualification to that, of course, is particularly for surface rail or for road projects, those areas around the nodes, either around the stations or indeed around the interchange and so on, is where the gain takes place, and everybody else gets the pain or is disadvantaged. I mean, hence Peter Hall talked this morning about HS2, hence the debate in the UK about the impact of I know for a fact that both Hong Kong and Japan made use of land value uplifts as a means to fund infrastructure. And in those contexts, it seems to work very well. In the UK, I'm not sure, I did some consulting work some time ago for Network Rail and suggested that they might like to think about using the air rights over a station. And we're not here to do development, we're here to run a railway. So that was kind of thrown out. Yeah, I mean, that's, as I say, whether it's applicable in all contexts, I'm not sure. Harry, anything to add?
Well, the only point I would like to add is that putting all the eggs in one basket is a very risky exercise, because the real estate values are in turn dependent on global economic climate, and you can have downturns in real estate. So if you rely on the private sector real estate uplifts to pay for your project, and you've got an economic downturn, you're not going to get your money from real estate either. You may do, but this is when you make judgments of when you make judgments about success and failure. You may get your money later on down the line, but perhaps not immediately. But the principle is correct. I would say absolutely accessibility, but we won't go into this is Elliot's field, but affordable accessibility is important.
Maybe I should just say.
Can I just come back on two small points?
Yeah.
The people that are disadvantaged, if I was to build a nuclear power station outside your front door, nobody would want to buy your house. But with a land value tax globally or within that jurisdiction, you would get a drop in the taxes that you pay. But under our system, you don't get a reduction in your income tax or your VAT. But with land value tax, you would get a reduction in your land tax bill if you're disadvantaged. The other thing is regarding speculative land values, what you need to value is the underlying annual rental value of the land, not the speculative price that developers pay.
This afternoon we will have a couple of sessions to discuss these issues, and to begin with, related to your presentation, maybe there are some short questions, and following on that I will share a session on the power of the context, and later on we have this discussions and presentations from different case studies other COEs. So I think we will retake a number of issues during the afternoon. And maybe I should present myself to begin with. My name is Marie Tinel. I'm from University of Gothenburg, School of Global Studies. So we will just make this round of short questions to Phil. And there was a question here. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah, you.
Shall I wait?
Yeah.
Ken Livingston got me wondering about whether or not we're giving the Iron Triangle a bit of a hard time. The London motorway programme that he got involved in the mid-70s, I think could have been rejected in Iron Triangle terms. The cost, the time, and most importantly, the specification. It was absurdly specified. And at the inquiry where Ken and his jaw got involved, I was involved preparing evidence against the Department of Transport, and it became manifestly clear that the traffic that was forecast to go down the Archway Road in northwest London could not possibly be accommodated in inner London. And so the specification for the project from the very beginning was a nonsense. And I don't think you have to go outside the Iron Triangle to conclude that. I don't think attitudes, people say attitudes changed. I think that more people became aware of the nonsense of the specification.
I mean, if I can respond, I don't think in any sense we're trying to say that the Iron Triangle is disreputable or anything like that. I think what we're saying is, on its own, it's not a good means of given all of these contextual implications of the mega project. It's not on its own a good way to look at project success. And quite often, I remember from a previous life, in a sense, trying to get across to my colleagues when looking at different project solutions, the idea that you could pay, let's use some figures off the top of my head, $100 million project A, or $160 million for project B, where project A was fundamentally different to project B. And it was on a much smaller scale than that, but you sense my meaning, that actually was very difficult to kind of get that idea across. And actually in this country, something we talked about yesterday in our group, in this country we're not terribly good at looking at the do-nothing scenario either, which also has a pretty fundamental impact on the way you position the project.
Okay, thank you. Yulin?
There is one observation that many mega projects come along with the major events. And that means could be what we could be the partly they prepared for the major events, because I think that's the one way we decided by driven by the major events. It's a too short time decision. Implementation time is too short. So what's your observation or your you can comment on that?
The conclusions that we came to were that obviously these mega projects exist in a very specific contextual frame, a time period and a particular political situation. So it's kind of hard to give generic lessons that apply fundamentally right down the line. What we did observe was that when they arise, they're very good at kind of speeding up projects. But sometimes that has a pretty negative effect, in as much as it draws resources away from other projects. It becomes an element of national prestige, if you like, to the extent that many other considerations are either kind of swept aside or are receive little attention, or other needs tend to be pushed to one side. But there's no question that they do kind of focus the mind those planning and delivering projects.
And then I will take two more, and we will finish this round.
Chris Lew, in actuarial profession. in your 30 projects that you studied, did you come across many where the decision makers were totally uncertain about certain aspects in the wider context, and they specifically designed their project to be robust and flexible, even at additional cost?
I would say, if any, very few. I think it was of the 30 that we looked at, they tended to be, at least for the particular moments in time when the project was being planned, there was an idea of what the project should look like, a pretty firm idea, albeit that those did change. I mean, go back to Channel Tunnel Railway. I mean, as my colleague mentioned yesterday, initially it was all about getting from the Channel Tunnel to London. Changed from the over time. My colleagues here, and in the wider sense from our other universities, may correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I came across, or we came across, any that were from the outset planned as being, capable of, if you like, being implemented in bite-sized pieces in an ad hoc manner. Some happened like that by force of circumstances, but I don't recall any that came.
And Elliot?
I have a question. It's a little broader question. This morning, when Sir Peter was speaking and Ken Livingstone, one of the things that did come up, they talk about projects that had been thought about. For example, the Victoria line. It went back to the 40s. It didn't open until the 8th, but it was first thought about in 38 and 39. The question that I have, and what you just talked about, this question of flexibility. Mega projects tend to have a very long shelf life as concepts, and they seem to endure through thick and thin. And I guess the question I have is, why do the ideas behind these mega projects seem to persist for so long? And even though everything else might change, and as you point out in your presentation, the boundaries are often very soft around what they are. And I'm interested in this notion of the persistence of the ideas that lead to the mega projects, and what you all have discovered maybe about that topic in your research.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Some of these have been around for an awful long time, and they do tend to persist. I think that is absolutely a fair comment. Remember, during the course of my talk, a lot of it is about projects that kind of exist on paper but don't seem to be going anywhere. Then somebody sensing that the time is right to actually launch these projects. And it's those, I'd say particularly, those are the people that are contextually aware, be they in the private sector, the public sector, or politics, or whatever, who have that sense that, now is a good time, we can do this. Whether the project goes ahead in its original form or in some kind of amended form. In the case of Oxford, again, because I don't know particularly well, Channel Tunnel Railway, the original idea arose in the 19th century, but we stopped it because we were afraid that Napoleon and his troops would come across and conquer the world.
Only if they get paid fair.
The probably would be privatised in those days, as to be said, but actually, what you raise is a very interesting question. I have to say, not one that I've thought too much of.
Our partner's a better place to respond to that.
Can I respond to that briefly? Hello. I think there are possibly various elements to this. One is that there's usually a sort of discourse around it's usually a kind of discourse around the project which supports it, and that is usually embedded in somewhere in some agency, in bureaucracy or elsewhere. In the case of Melbourne, the idea of CityLink, for example, was kind of part of the 1969 freeway plan, for one word. It was a transport plan, but it was a grid of freeways on the line, sort of on the same lines as the motorway plan in Melbourne. So that was a bottom drawer plan in a sense, of the roads authority. So usually the ideas don't exist just on their own. They have a sort of currency in various agencies, and they have supporters in those agencies. And sometimes the conjunction of events sort of suddenly activates them, and you think, well, where does this come from? But they've been around for a while. And so, I mean, we explain this to some extent as a form of park dependence, but a particular project is usually part of a wider discourse about how you go about solutions and what the problems are. And in the case of Melbourne, it's all about building roads, and the problem is identified as traffic congestion primarily, and building roads as a solution. But in a sense, it's the other way around. Building roads drives, as a solution, drives the identification of the problem. So people go around and try and find justifications for building roads, which are on the rather strange basis of time saving, which has never been proved to be to in fact occur, rather the reverse. But so I think, well, that's a partial explanation, but probably somewhat inadequate.
Yeah, we have a question from the side also, and then we will close this session and actually tackle off the discussion.
Thank you. Well, the question, in fact, goes from the previous session to this session. It seems to me that, from what it has been presented and discussed so far, that in each mega project we have, in fact, two types of completely different projects. In one side, we have the project that is managed and for which we have a number of tools, like the contracts, like the monitoring, like the transparency, the accountability, how do you define the scope of the project, juridically, financially, etc. But then we have another type of project that cannot be managed the same way, but that is encompassed within the same. That is the project as a political asset. And this is born exactly with this concept that Elliot was asked, it seems to me. And for this project, we do not have defined the tools yet, because this project has a different life cycle from the other one, from the physical one. And because it has a different life cycle, it will have different tools. And here we are talking most likely of coalitions, we are talking of managing the lobby, but it is the managing of a political asset. And this is a consequence of the fact that each of these projects has a very powerful opportunity outcome. And this opportunity outcome, which is normally embodied in the original narrative that justifies it politically, and this second part, so this political asset, is something that we still don't know how to manage and how to deal with it. Because in fact it is materialized in the same project than the physical one, but it is another story, completely different one, with different tools and with a different one. And I think it seems to me that this is a door open that this project that you have developed, that clearly shows. It's a new window, it's something new that comes into the management of this type of project. And I think that it is worth highlighting.
I mean, if I may, just make some observations in response. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that the sort of lessons I mean, this was literally a very kind of helicopter view. I'm more and more convinced that actually, fundamentally, our lessons, if they are to resonate, really need to be at the project planning and appraisal stage, or project conception, actually, project conception, planning and appraisal. because at some point in the project lifecycle, you do need to kind of take a view and say, right, this is what we're going to build. Now, our lessons by that point, I would argue, are largely, it's too late. You really need to be in the light of the so, that kind of builds on really what you're saying. I couldn't agree
But
more.
it seems to me that it is needed to break the language in them.
Yes,
Because if we continue to talk about
Yeah.
project conception, appraisal, etc., everybody will think about the physical project and the way and the many tools we have already to deal with that type of project. And this is something that has been there from the very beginning, but it has been invisible so far.
Which means invisible because the language isn't there.
Exactly.
But it's
The
there.
language isn't there.
But you have not really looked at the language. I think you haven't looked at the language close enough, or the narrative close enough. Because if you were to do that, I think you would find exactly what Husar is talking about.
Because
Well,
this is not encompassed in the cost-benefit analysis, no. It's another type of accounting.
Yes.
Well,
It's the political accounting,
Yes.
which is something that is an element and a required and valuable element in a democratic
And that's real, that's the concept.
Exactly.
Even making politicians and planners aware of the degree to which these projects are agents of change is, and that I think in terms of language is actually something that's understandable. But getting that message out is our job right now, I have to say. But you're right, and I think it occurred to me while we had a session yesterday on who should do what differently. And it occurred to me that language is actually one thing that we need to focus on. It's no good, telling a planner that he needs to develop plans that are sustainable. What the hell does that mean to him? We have in the UK planning guidance that says, planners should develop plans that reduce the need to travel. Now, if I'm a planner receiving that advice, what the hell to do?
But
So
even the
again,
decision
language
process
is
and the institutions has to be different, cannot be the same. The ones that manage one cannot be the same of the ones that manage the other.
Okay, thanks a lot.